Hello and welcome. You're watching this very special interaction we have planned for you with Gautam Kumra, who's the McKinsey India head right now, to help us understand how businesses are coping with COVID-related impact, what kind of strategies are they devising to navigate their way through, and overall, globally, how big organizations are working closely and reworking their models of economics and their business models, of course. So Gautam, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. I hope everything is safe at your end and you guys are working smoothly from your respective homes.
Absolutely. So firstly, look, I hope we could call it post-COVID world. I don't think we can quite say that because I think as you and I know, I think we are both still very much living through COVID times. And I think the huge uncertainty is we don't know how long this is going to be. As you know, I think India, unfortunately, is scaling, particularly in the virus count. And we're seeing the count in the days to double is still pretty high relative to some of the other economies that can claim to have flattened the curve. So I think, firstly, I think it's too early to talk about post-COVID times. I think we are for quite some time in this phase of transition to what the next normal is going to be. And I think for now it is during COVID times, I would put it.
Gautam, what are you making of this new normal we are talking about? Economists and strategists have coined the term now pre-COVID and post-COVID. How are you analyzing the way things stand right now in post-COVID new world, which all of us are coming to terms with?
I think if we learn from the previous crisis, and I think even more so now, we will see increasing polarization. And when I say polarization, I mean polarization between better performing and worse performing sectors of the economy, and polarization between the best performers and the worst performers in any one sector. Now, just to give you a historical perspective, if you look at even going into the crisis, you look at over the last decade or two, the Indian corporate sector invested about $1 trillion into the economy, and roughly 85% of that invested capital did not create a fair economic profit. Only about 15% of the total capital that was invested into the Indian corporate sector over these 2 decades created returns in excess of cost of capital. So you already had going in, and by the way, to give you examples, sectors like IT, telecom, actually IT, pharma in particular, and consumer goods, I would say, are the ones that would fit into the category of 15%. And the remaining 85% was a lot of industrial and heavy capital intensive sectors. So already going into the crisis, you had the haves and the have-nots. What's happening now is the gap between the best performing sectors. And if you look at simply market capitalization since the crisis has struck, you would have seen how IT and pharmaceuticals have actually done rather well. And on the other hand, energy, tourism, automotive, and so forth are actually suffering quite badly. And as time goes by, you see the gap is only increasing. The last thing I'd say is, if you look at any one sector, you can literally take any sector, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's automotive, you look at the gap between the top 10% best performing companies on economic profit, and you compare that with the 10% worst performing companies on economic profit in that sector, that gap is actually increasing as time goes by. And that gap is in fact even much bigger. So the degree of polarization now is even bigger than what we have witnessed in the 2008 crisis.
Historically, we've seen that each crisis actually gives tailwind to a certain set of businesses. Economy gets disrupted, of course. There are a certain end of the businesses which become bigger, and the other ones which actually deteriorate because of change in the tectonic shift which happen in the environment. Which end of the business, in your view, will actually emerge as a winner and much stronger in this new environment?
Well, firstly, I think this has already been a trend. I think you go back to pre-COVID times, I think we had not seen the emergence of trillion-dollar market cap companies globally until this last decade. So I think that phenomenon, as you well know, even pre-COVID, a lot of the market cap and the value creation had been on the back of a handful of large tech companies globally, I think, or literally 5 or 6. And same has been true, by the way, in China, as you know. I think it's really been 2 or 3 tech companies that have driven disproportionate share of the overall value creation. So I think that phenomenon, first of all, has been global. It's been tech-driven to quite a large extent, and frankly has been there even pre-COVID. I think what the crisis is going to do, at least for some time, is I think going to further polarize that, and I think it's going to further extenuate a trend that has been in the making for quite some time.
So Gautam, this polarization which we are talking about, how long could it extend itself and how powerful is this phenomena? If I were to talk about globally, the way Microsoft, Amazon are, the kind of valuations they've started to garner, even back home here, the difference between, say, Reliance Industries, for example purposes, and say TCS is now a yawning $50 billion. What do you make of this polarization which is taking place in this environment?
I'd start by saying, look, if there was no uncertainty, you wouldn't need leaders. Yes, let's think about it, right? If we would all predict exactly how the world is going to be, I think we could have a bunch of managers running companies and there'd be no disproportionate rewards for leadership. So I think leadership is needed and tested only in times like this. Now, having said that, I think when you are dealing with this kind of uncertainty, I think companies have to think about strategy as a portfolio of initiatives. And I see three kinds of things. One is, I think, no regret moves. So, for example, one of my clients has, very high cost base. 50% of the cost base is fixed cost. They won't be able to sustain that when demand is plummeting by 20, 30%. So they have to just take a massive relook at the entire cost base and restructure it. So that's an example of what I call a no regret move. Second is a bold move. For example, one of the airline CEO I was talking to, with obviously no business in airlines virtually, I think he is making a bold move in building a cargo business. Similarly, one of my logistics clients is finding a huge opportunity in building a hyperlocal logistics business. So second is bold moves, looking at where the opportunity is and making a bold move. And when I say a bold move, I mean disproportionately investing your human and financial capital into an area of opportunity. Third is options. For example, one of my pharmaceutical CEOs is thinking of taking a position in a small startup, which he thinks can add to their digital capability. And it's not a lot of money, it's probably a few $1 million of investment, but it gives them the option to learn from that company and potentially hire in some of the talent that this company has on the digital side. So I think when you're dealing with uncertainty, I think companies have to think about strategy as a portfolio of no regrets, bold moves, and options.
Well, Gautam, you interact with corporates of all sizes across the country, spanning several sectors. How are they going about or talking about investing for future? Because investing is all about taking decisions in an uncertain future. And when the environment is so uncertain, acutely uncertain, how would one go about investing, be it large businesses or even investing community?
So look, firstly, let's put this in a macro context, right? Let's look at where the economy is now and where it is headed, right? And I think there are dime a dozen forecasts available, but I think by and large there's now a consensus that this year I think the economy is going to contract by anywhere between, frankly, 4 to 9%, right? So that's the first thing we need to recognize, that first time in the history of India, an economy that has delivered 7% economic growth rate for 20 years now, for the first time in our history since we started liberalization, we are going to contract anywhere between 4 to 9%. And most people believe that the economy would come back to its current levels by hopefully second half of 22. But again, it depends a lot on how the virus behaves and how the policy responses fructify. So that's the first point. Second thing I'd say is a lot depends on what reforms we as a country take now, which will actually determine the pace of not just the revival in the next 2 years, but to what extent we come back on the track of 9% growth from hopefully 2022 onwards. So that's the first response I would give. And I think, probably if you ask me personally, I think we do see the potential has always been there. I think it's a function of, whether we make some of those bold structural reforms on land, labor, capital, which I think will make a difference to our trajectory on what happens to us post this corona window. As far as some of the corporations are concerned, look, you called it survival, renewal, and growth. I think it's still evolving. You see, my sense is industry structures will change. In certain sectors, for example, you will see consolidation. You look at what's happened in telecom even pre-COVID, and I think that kind of phenomenon, I think will happen more so because many companies won't be able to sustain. If you look at the top 500 BSC companies, 60% of them have less than 90 days of cash. Right? So many of these are going to run out of cash. They're not going to have the ability to access capital. Many of them would merge and amalgamate and so forth. So I think, I don't know whether that fits into your survival or renewal category, but I think you will see a lot more M&A activity in combination. I think you will also see an emergence of many new business models. You talked about growth. I think there's going to be massive growth in virtually many sectors. You look at how pharmaceuticals is moving with massive push towards digital. You look at retail, where omni-channel is the big trend. You look at banking, where I think obviously very uncertain times now, but you will see the emergence of much more machine learning and artificial intelligence driven decision making in the banking system. So that's, I think those are the phenomena that I see happening.
Gautam, if one were to really divide the economy in three buckets: survival, revival, and growth, when once things settle down and many of the businesses actually survive this kind of a pandemic-led anemic growth, which end of the businesses will actually prosper and grow? What are your thoughts on that?
So look, firstly, let's put this in a macro context, right? Let's look at where the economy is now and where it is headed, right? And I think there are dime a dozen forecasts available, but I think by and large there's now a consensus that this year I think the economy is going to contract by anywhere between, frankly, 4 to 9%, right? So that's the first thing we need to recognize, that first time in the history of India, an economy that has delivered 7% economic growth rate for 20 years now, for the first time in our history since we started liberalization, we are going to contract anywhere between 4 to 9%. And most people believe that the economy would come back to its current levels by hopefully second half of 22. But again, it depends a lot on how the virus behaves and how the policy responses fructify. So that's the first point. Second thing I'd say, a lot depends on what reforms we as a country take now, which will actually determine the pace of not just the revival in the next 2 years, but to what extent we come back on the track of 9% growth from hopefully 2022 onwards. So that's the first response I would give. And I think, if you ask me personally, I think we do see the potential has always been there. I think it's a function of, whether we make some of those bold structural reforms on land, labor, capital, which I think will make a difference to our trajectory on what happens to us post this corona window. As far as some of the corporations are concerned, look, you called it survival, renewal, and growth. I think it's still evolving. You see, my sense is industry structures will change. In certain sectors, for example, you will see consolidation. You look at what's happened in telecom even pre-COVID, and I think that kind of phenomenon, I think will happen more so because many companies won't be able to sustain. If you look at the top 500 BSC companies, 60% of them have less than 90 days of cash, right? So many of these are going to run out of cash. They're not going to have the ability to access capital. Many of them would merge and amalgamate and so forth. So I think, I don't know whether that fits into your survival or renewal category, but I think you will see a lot more M&A activity in combination. I think you will also see an emergence of many new business models. You talked about growth. I think there's going to be massive growth in virtually many sectors. You look at how pharmaceuticals is moving with massive push towards digital. You look at retail, where omni-channel is the big trend. You look at banking, where I think obviously very uncertain times now, but you will see the emergence of much more machine learning and artificial intelligence driven decision making in the banking system. So that's, I think those are the phenomena that I see happening.
Let's shift focus now and talk about how digitization and digital economy is actually blossoming as a tailwind because of COVID. How do you see that phenomena take shape or accelerate in the coming months and years, and how seriously will individuals, organizations adopt digitization, and how business models will actually evolve around it in your view?
Look, digital, as we all know, is one of the biggest megatrends of our current times. Even pre-COVID, and we had published a paper, in fact, last year that asserted that India is the second fastest digitizing country in the world after Indonesia. And we believe that by about 2025, the digital capabilities have the potential to deliver about $1 trillion to India's GDP. Now, if you break that down, I think a chunk of that comes from what I would describe as traditional digital-oriented products and services, be it telecom, be it BPO, be it IT services, be it communication, and so forth. I think that's a piece of it. But I think the other piece, which could be about $300 to $400 billion of that $1 trillion, is the application of digital really to many of our traditional services. So, for example, it's about e-learning platforms. It's about using it's about developing a digital logistics platform. For example, many of my clients are now setting up what do you call centralized cockpits to actually monitor the movement of man and material to ensure full supply availability. You could talk about digital services. As you know, today with COVID, when patients can't see doctors and doctors can't be in clinics, we've seen a massive surge in remote, call it remote services and remote management. Even industrial activities, for example, remote maintenance of plants, I think some of it is going digital. You see many of the service operations, they are in fact, many of them have asserted that even post-corona, they will not come back at work. So to put it all kinds of services, I think have the potential to drive another $1 trillion in India's GDP. If I give you one example, I was talking to a pharmaceutical client of mine. Pharma industry has an EBITDA margin of about 20-21% on average. If you think about end-to-end application of digital technologies could add about 3 to 4 percentage points to their EBITDA margin and potentially a 2 to 3% more to their growth. So it's pretty serious and very, very central to CEO and management agendas.
Something unique which is being seen in the economy is the sharp collapse in demand. By when do you actually see demand revival setting in the Indian economy? Because all the other measures, be it supply chain related measures, capacity utilization related measures, all of that eventually only are fruitful when there is a demand revival, and India has really not seen a very sharp collapse in demand revival in a very long time. How do you see that particular point improve going forward?
I think that's well put. Yes, we've had the demand has been under pressure for some time, and that is the big issue. And I think, by the way, what is interesting is when you go into certain sectors, subsectors, you find that in some places it is actually turning into a supply issue. But by and large, I would say macro, I would agree with you. I think demand is the bigger issue. In some subsectors, supply is an issue given where things are. And I think, and frankly, it varies a ton by sector. You look at non-discretionary retail, I think it's going up quite nicely. You look at demand for digital services, everything digital is actually going up nicely. So I think that is one extreme. On the other hand, we all know, I think that in other sectors, I think demand is under serious pressure and the consumer sentiment is changing, but by and large, most people are being extremely cautious in terms of where to spend their money and downgrading that will happen with consumer spending. I think it's a real issue. And I think one of the things that I think we need to think about is how can you put more money in the hands of people to spend? A lot of measures have been taken by the government, but perhaps more can be done and should be done to put more money in the hands of people to spend.
Gautam, let's shift focus and talk about the startup ecosystem. Up till now, we saw SoftBanks and Alibabas of the world really plowing a lot of capital. Liquidity was easily to come by, valuations were being chased at. But in this kind of a disrupted world, how do you see the private equity, especially the startup ecosystem, get capital, and what kind of changes do you see, and how would they survive this kind of a new environment? Because you do work with very closely on consulting side about the entire startup and this gig economy, as we say it. What are your thoughts there?
I think there are 2-3 components to your question. Maybe if we separate them out. I think firstly, as far as startups, because startups, as you know, go way beyond just shared mobility. Obviously, I think it is a difficult time for a lot of them in terms of fundraising. And I think cash is king. I think, as you know, I think for the last couple of months, everybody has been working hard to conserve cash and make it last as long as possible. And many are repivoting their business models. I think there's a segment that frankly are just dead, either because the business model just doesn't make any sense in current times, or frankly, they just didn't have the cash to last. The others that I think are well positioned, they have cash, they can string it out 12, 18 months. And frankly, there's a small minority, which I think is actually doing extremely well and still able to get financing. So it's a segmented sort of set of situations. But even last night, I was talking to somebody who was quite active in the space, and they were saying that more than half of the startups in their ecosystem is potentially exposed to may not survive beyond the next 6 months. So I think it's a serious issue. It's a serious issue. And I think it will be really sad to see a lot of this innovation not come to fruition. To your point about shared mobility, there's a class of opportunities, obviously, I think is under massive stress. Massive stress, I think, globally and in India. And I think that will take a long time to recover. They are also repivoting. I think they are also pivoting into other segments, other models. Finally, you point about private capital. I actually think that could be positive news. In India, if you look at last year, we got about $50 billion in FDI coming into India. I think India, if we get our act together in this sea of challenges, could still be a massive opportunity for a lot of the private investors, and hopefully, we should be able to attract at least some of the private capital into the country.
The other big phenomena which we are actually observing is the phenomena of deglobalization. Large economies are looking inwards to fulfill with their resources the requirements, be it Atmanirbhar mission of India, be it America first, and especially in the light of global supply chains getting disrupted. What kind of opportunities do you see emerging, and what do you make of this inward look inwards first kind of phenomena which several large countries, including India, is now going forward to?
Is a very important global phenomenon. There's about $17 trillion of global trade happening annually, right? And if you look at it, Asia roughly drives about 40% of that. One trend we have been seeing already pre-COVID is that supply chains have been increasingly getting regionalized. So in other words, there is more traffic within Asia from one country to the other. There's more traffic within the European continent between one country and the other. So one trend that we've been seeing is regionalization of supply chains that frankly will probably get further exacerbated. I think the second trend we are seeing obviously is, I think, the dislocation, as we all know, away from some of the traditional centers like China. I think, and some of it has been moving, as you know, for the last year or two to other markets like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and so forth. You see, if you look at it from India's standpoint, there are two ways to look at it. One is import substitution. Second is accelerating exports. We have about $600 billion of imports, 450 in products, 150 in services. There are big components like, if you look at the components piece, chemicals, which frankly, there's a massive opportunity in import substituting a lot of that stuff that India imports. And we think we are competitive in many of those chemical value chains. We are competitive in many of those casting, fabrication, and so forth. On the other hand, I think there is an opportunity to also accelerate more on the export side. We've seen what Vietnam has done, right, from being a current account deficit to becoming a current account surplus country. And for India, there's no future unless we actually finally get act together on the manufacturing side. And I think we have to, because if India has to grow, our productivity has to grow, and that can't happen unless we get manufacturing up. So whether it's electronics or mobile or so forth, I think there is a major opportunity. The challenges, as we all know, are really around ease of doing business, improving our cost competitiveness, single window clearances. I think some initial headway has been made, but a lot more needs to be done for us to capitalize on these global supply chain movements.
Something which is really common in most of the crisis is the way cycle actually happens. After the boom and bust, risk capital starts looking for opportunity once again, and growth gradually starts crawling back. Do you think that cycle will play out in the similar fashion this time around, and here in India as well? But we have not really seen such bad headlines of bankruptcies, global models going bust so far. Will it all be different this time?
Well, hard to say, but I think I would say it's difficult to generalize, because I think India is not, well, as a country, we don't have quite the same resources that a market like the US has. And I think I think we have to acknowledge our own challenges. I think if you look at it, the economy does take this dent, and NPAs rise by 4 to 5 percentage points on top of already 8 to 9%. I think that could put a real serious challenge to the banking system. So I think we will have, and that, by the way, phase hasn't even quite yet started. So I think I'm cautious about how this thing would unfold. I think it is inevitable that you will see much more corporate restructuring. I think I would hope that the banks would be allowed to facilitate that more aggressively and allow creation of more competitive firms. Because I think the biggest issue in India is actually creating more globally competitive firms. We have today about $500 billion plus companies. For India to reach its $5 trillion goal in the next decade or so, we need about 2,000 more competitive firms. And I want to underline the word competitive, because if you look at return on assets for large Indian companies has been going down for the last decade. So we need to create companies that are productive and competitive. In many sectors, our productivity is 1/3 to 1/5 of comparable sectors elsewhere in the world. So if we have to emerge stronger from the crisis, maybe the one thing I would highlight is the need to develop more competitive global firms from India. And to do so, I think we need to take, again, structural reform on multiple counts, including, by the way, making more risk capital available for these companies, including reducing the cost of capital, which, as you know, compared to China is more than 5 percentage points higher even now. So I think hopefully if all of that happens, in the best case scenario, we could see the emergence of these more competitive firms. Otherwise, I think if you don't get act together, then we will slumber along, and it could be much more of a protracted recession than it has to be.
All right, Gautam, I'll let you go on that one. Thanks so much for joining us. That was a very insightful conversation we had about the big trends you are observing taking shape. I'm sure our viewers would really enjoy insights and the knowledge which you have brought to the table today. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.